Ladies and gentlemen, I'm George Thorman. I'd like to welcome you to a program of local history. Tonight I have two very distinguished St. Thomas citizens with me, Dr. Douglas Carey on my right, and Norman Scott, better known as Nipper, on my left. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time in introduction. We're going to take you back about 42 years to 1918, when both of these gentlemen were in the Royal Air Force and had distinguished careers in that Royal Air Force. I'm going to start right off, Dr. Carey, by asking you when you enlisted, and just tell us about the first couple of years.
I enlisted when I was at the University of Toronto in later 1915. Percy Spackman and I enlisted in the transport company, and he and I went to France in 1916 driving a truck. We drove a truck for 18 months in France, and at that time there was a shortage of pilots in the Air Force, so there was a notice put up in our notice board in France that any of our members that would apply or would like to transfer to the Air Force, their applications would be received by the Flying Corps. So I volunteered to learn to fly. This was in 1917, and Percy Spackman, my friend, he was 100 miles away from where I was, but he also applied, and neither one of us knew that the other was applying to join the Air Force. Now, after graduating in flying in the spring of 1918...
Where'd you take your training, in England?
In England. I took it in Doncaster, England. That was the first aerodrome. And we learned to fly on what they call a Rumpty machine. They were brought out about 1905. It was a pusher type of airplane and had no fuselage. It was entirely open. You were just sitting on a seat. And then I graduated from there after making 18 landings, and I was sent to Spitalgate, which is at Grantham, England. And there I learned to fly the AW-90, and then finally the AW-160, which is the Armstrong-Whitworth plane, a two-seater observation plane.
And then when you finished that, when were you posted back to France?
I was posted back to France about the 1st of July in 1918.
All right.
And I joined number 10 squadron, and the aerodrome was in Droglans, Belgium or France, and we were not far from Ypres, about 10 miles from Ypres. And so I flew from that aerodrome for the next 4 or 5 months.
All right, and I'm going to leave you in your aerodrome in France to go back here to Nipper. Now, when Dr. Carey wasn't a doctor then, when he joined up in 1915, you were still in high school, I imagine.
Yeah.
And then you finished. Now tell us about your career, how you joined up.
It was in August 1917 that 4 of us fellows around town decided we should be in the Flying Corps. Ken McPherson and Roy Dubber, who was a farm boy out west of town, and George Ponsford and I. So we all went down to Toronto, and we were all accepted, all passed the medical, and we were sent up to the University of Toronto residences first to be billeted there, and we spent about 3 weeks taking classes. They didn't really amount to anything because we never used them again, but it was pleasant. And we had good meals and a good place to sleep. But when I landed in these residences, these other fellows had got ahead of me, and they were in one down the hall. And when I got there were 3 Americans in mine. So one of them was a red-headed, stub-nosed guy from Brooklyn. Another one was a very suave son of a Kentucky judge. And the third one was a studious type from New York. He was a newspaper man. And that guy I got to be friendly with, and we still correspond every 2 or 3 weeks after 65 years. And I went to New York twice to visit him, and he's been to my home. So he's been my lifelong friend. Well, after we'd taken these crazy lessons about how to take a Vickers gun apart and put it back together again, which you could never do in the air, of course. You brought it home and let the armorer do it, you know. They taught us to use a Morse code. We never used that. They taught us theory of flight. Now, we didn't build airplanes, we flew the damn things. They taught us a lot of stupid things that didn't amount to anything. However, then we were sent to a flying school to learn to fly.
Where was the flying school?
Well, I went to one called Rathman down near Belleville, and the other three guys in my group went to a Mohawk, which was just on the other side of Belleville. And that's where we took our first flying lessons. Now, the day...
What kind of a plane did you learn to fly on?
Curtiss Jennies. Everybody flew on a Curtiss Jenny. And when we were marched out onto the aerodrome the first morning, 6 or 8 of us in a group, and we had one instructor. And he said, now these are airplanes. Now that doesn't sound so stupid as it sounds, because some of these guys had never seen an airplane.
I'd never seen one.
I saw one in 1912 at Port Stanley. There was a barnstorming fellow came there on a float plane, and it was very primitive. He didn't have any nacelle or anything. He just sat on the leading edge of the lower plane with his feet out on a rudder bar, and he flew very cautiously out about maybe a mile, at not more than 50 feet high, and turned around and came back and landed, and that was it. And I flew the second airplane I ever saw.
Yeah.
These that were sitting out in front of the tarmac. First thing happened was he took each of us up for about a 5-minute joyride, just across the aerodrome and back. And then he began to take us up for 20 minutes and let us handle the controls, and we didn't try any landings for the first 2 or 3 times, because the landing is the difficult. Anybody can fly an airplane on level flight up in the air, anybody. But it's the landing that's the difficult part. Well, I had 2 hours and 55 minutes in the air before I was sent off solo. And that morning, he took me for a ride across the aerodrome. I was flying, I mean, and then when we landed, he got out and said, well, she's all yours, away you go. So your first solo was to fly to the other side of the aerodrome, make a turn, fly down to the other end, make a turn, come back, and land. No funny work, just do that. So I did it, and when I made the best damn landing I ever did, I put that thing down so smoothly you couldn't even feel the bump. And when I taxied up, I thought I had really done it up, you know. He gave me hell. He said, why, you stupid so-and-so. Apparently, instead of making nice, easy turns at the corners, I was doing this. I was doing vertical banks and side-slipping horribly, you know. I didn't know anything about side slips. They say that he got so bad, he put his hands over his face, he wouldn't look. However, he relented. And that afternoon, he said, now, get in that airplane and fly, get up to 5,000 feet, fly from here to Kingston and back and forth. He said, I don't want to see you for 2 hours. So I got in there and got up to 5,000 feet, and pretty soon a great big white cloud floated by, you know. And here I am, flying between Belleville and Kingston. Beautiful farmland and woods to the north, and a road with little automobiles this long, pecking along. Here I am above the clouds, and of course out to the south was the beautiful sparkling Lake Ontario. I thought that was the most magnificent moment in my life, to be up there flying this beautiful flying carpet all by myself and all this landscape down below, you know. So that's the way I learned to fly.
Well,
I never had an instructor in the plane again, ever.
You had a little over 2 hours with the instructor.
2 hours and 55 minutes exactly.
Now, what about you, Dr. Carrie?
Well, it took me a bit longer. I think I had instruction for nearly 5 hours before I actually
He was
went
flying
solo.
a great big lumbering bloody thing as wide as from here across the street.
Yeah, we were flying big stuff.
But the plane that you learned on, was that was the plane that Nipper was talking about, the 1912 plane that
He's
didn't have
talking about
feet?
something you wouldn't believe.
Oh yes, there was no fuselage. It was just bamboo there, and you looked below, and there was the ground.
Well, now we've Nipper, you went from you qualified here, then you went to England, and you had a little bit of flying there.
We went to Camp Borden before we qualified, And when we were at Camp Borden, we did a few things that were a little more difficult than just what we had learned at Belleville. For one thing, we had to make 2 long-distance flights from Camp Borden to Toronto and back, and land on a strange aerodrome. Leaside was one of them, and Armour Heights was another. And that was quite a thing to make a long-distance flight like that. And then you had to learn to fly in formation and learn to fire live ammunition at a towed target. And it became, it wasn't kid stuff anymore. It was, I'll tell you one thing, though, that maybe most people don't know. Nobody knew what caused a spin. And those jennies would spin at the drop of a hat. And every time anybody got into a spin at 1,000 feet or 100 feet, they were dead, no question. They just spun into the ground, that's all. Well, there was an Englishman. Well, I bet you we lost 8 men in a week up there once. There was an English instructor came along. Oh, he said, it's quite simple, you know. Simply put the joystick in neutral and apply opposite rudder. That's all there was to it.
Yeah.
And nobody spun again. But my God,
did you have that
spinning is caused by losing
Jenny.
No.
They didn't have them in England.
No.
losing flying speed, and as soon as you lose flying speed, one wing drops,
Yeah.
and then you're done.
Yeah.
If you don't know how to stop it.
Yeah. Well, okay. So then you finished off in England, target practice, and then you're posted to France the 1st July 1980.
Let me tell you how lucky I was. When we landed in London, we thought we had a choice as to what we would be flying, you know. Yeah. We thought we had. And we'd heard about DH-4s and DH-9s and what wonderful machines they were. They were bombers. No. But luckily, they put us on Bristol fighters. We didn't carry bombs, and that's what saved my life. That's why I'm sitting here now, because these other guys got shot down like flies.
The Bristol bomber, the Bristol fighter was a 2-seater plane.
Oh, yes, but then it didn't carry bombs. That's the main thing.
All right. This is, perhaps we can pick this up. This is a
Bristol
fighter, a biplane and 2 seats, and it didn't carry bombs.
We could climb to 20,000 feet just as well as a Scout, and we could maneuver just about as well as a Scout.
But you couldn't stay up at 20,000 feet very long because there's no oxygen there.
Oh, yeah, well, I've flown higher than that. I've flown at 21,000 without a sniff of oxygen.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then I'm going to leave you, Nipper, for a minute. I'm going back, Dr. Carey. You finished your training in England on the Armstrong Whitworth, or the Big Ack, as it was called.
That's right.
And then you were posted back to France in 1918. And your plane was a plane designed for reconnaissance and bombing and strafing, eh?
That's right.
Yeah. Well, would you tell me something about your kind of routine on the aerodrome?
The routine depended entirely on whether there was a push-on by the troops or whether the war was stationary. In times when there wasn't any push-on, our machine did work with the artillery, and we took photographs the other side of the line. And we occasionally dropped bombs. In fact, we always dropped bombs every time we went over. We were glad to get rid of them.
Tell me about an artillery thing. I found this very interesting. You, of course, had to learn Morse code the same as Snipper did.
And I sent the signals down to the artillery brigade, and when they got my signal, they'd put a ground strip out, the letter L, which meant they were ready to fire. And when I saw the L there, I'd send down the words GG, which is to fire, and then I would watch them, and I'd see the explosion of the, and then I knew the target, of course, and I'd fly over the target and see where the shell exploded, and I would send back corrections. Yeah. And at one time they might go 30 feet beyond the target, and I'd send that correction down, and the next time they might go 20 feet short. Yeah. And the third time, they'd bang right on the target.
Well, now, after you send down the message for the battery to fire the ranging rounds, then you moved your airplane towards where the target was. Now, you were flying about 2,500 feet.
Once I was, but I never did it again.
No, you were lucky. Now, what happened to 2,500 feet?
After I'd given the word fire, suddenly I saw a shell go by me, and it just missed my plane, and it was on the way to the target. So I vacated the level of 2,500 feet and flew up to 4,000, and I got above where the shells were. And nobody ever told me that. I had to find it out myself.
Well, that's a very interesting method of ranging.
Well, we did that when there wasn't any activity.
Yeah.
Now, when there was a push on, when the infantry were attacking, I was assigned to what they called contact patrol. I would fly over from 50 to 100 feet above the infantry, and I'd machine gun the enemy troops and drop a bomb on them.
Yeah.
And usually we got pretty well riddled with machine gun bullets just from the ground.
Yeah.
We weren't attacked by airplanes.
No.
It was all ground fire that got us. But fortunately, they shot up my plane very often, but they never happened to get me.
Now, the interesting thing, you had an observer, but you had to do everything. You had to fly the plane, you had to drop the bombs, you had to fire the machine gun,
Yeah.
and you had to open a little slat in the floor and take pictures.
Yeah.
And all the observer was there for was just for what reason?
Just to observe a possible attack from enemy aircraft.
Yeah.
In other words, if he started doing things, an enemy aircraft could dive on you and put
Yeah.
you out of business. So his only job was to operate a rotating machine gun behind me
Yeah, for protection.
for protection.
Yeah.
And he never did anything except look in the skies for enemy aircraft.
Well, let's leave that for a minute. That's when there's no big push on. Now, Nipper, when you got to your aerodrome there with the Bristol fighters, what was your daily routine like?
Well, ordinarily we had what they call the dawn show. 2 machines took off before daylight. And we had no landing lights or anything. It was kind of tricky because if your engine quit when you were up there, you had to land in the pitch dark, and it was very difficult. And these dawn shows flew from Arras to halfway down to home, say, maybe a mile or so over the lines, observing what the enemy were doing. Now, we couldn't see the troops coming in because they would be all in by this time, but we could see the troops leaving that had been in. We could see them marching down the communication trenches. Yeah. And we passed that information on to the Army, and then they knew that they had somebody different in front of them, and they've sent over a raid maybe that night and grabbed some bastard and brought him home to find out who he was, whether he was a Prussian or just an ordinary German, you see. But when you're talking about shells almost getting you there, I saw a shell disintegrate an airplane one day. There was an RE-8 flying down below me, and I was looking at him, and he just disappeared. Just as though somebody had emptied a wastebasket.
Yeah.
Now, what had happened to him, he got into the trajectory of an 8-inch howitzer shell.
Yeah. Well, that's
It
the
went
one that
right through him
passed
and
me.
didn't explode, but it tore him all to hell. Those guys departed this life in a hell of a hurry, I'll tell you.
Yeah, well, you were pretty lucky to actually see one of those
Yeah,
shells.
I saw
People don't
it- I saw
understand
it go
those
by.
shells don't travel that fast, do they? You can see
Well,
them.
they're fast, but you can easily see it.
Yeah.
And when you once saw it, you could follow it until it exploded.
Yeah.
Your sight would carry along.
I've seen a shell in the air, too.
Yeah.
But to get on with my little story, we had about maybe 5 or 6 flights during the day, sometimes 4 machines, sometimes 5, sometimes 6 or 8, depending on what we wanted to do. And as I say, we were reconnaissance and photographs, and we did some offensive patrols too. We escorted the bombers, and we were there to protect them from the Fokkers. If there were 10 bombers, say, going over to bomb Cambrai, they'd send 10 of our machines, and we'd fly above them like this, 5 here and 5 there, and the bombers down there. Bombers would be at 14,000, we'd be at 15 or 16. And we were there to fight off the Fokkers who would attack them, because the Fokkers didn't want them bombing their installations and their munition stuffs, you know.
Yeah.
So anyway, the next flight might be a 6-machine flight to fly over Denain, Douai, Cambrai, and back down south to Bapaume and Amiens and home again, just to see what was going on there. Well, then the next one might go the other way, and maybe at 3 o'clock in the afternoon there'd be another flight of 6 or 8, go down to Amiens and back around that way. Well, then there was always a show in the evening, just at dusk, and well, it was out there for the same reason. Now, mind you, on these flights, we very often encountered enemy aircraft, and there was a dogfight ensued, you know. So it wasn't just a case of flying over nice, peaceful territory. No. I shot down my first enemy aircraft on the dawn show one morning, and practically in the dark. It wasn't a victory, it was a cold-blooded murder, because this fellow just flew under me like that. Damn, there was a head-on, or at least an air collision, you know. And I saw this shape. So all I did was just pull back a little bit, and then I could see the black crosses on his wings. And I tipped my nose down and fired about 20 rounds and set him on fire, and he went down in a hell of a pyrotechnic with very lights flying out of the cockpit.
Well, roughly then, really in your plane, Dr. Carey, you're nearly always flying around 50, 100, a couple hundred feet.
Well, that's
and you were flying higher if you were flying,
well,
like your plane couldn't go as high as the Bristol.
On these dawn shows, we never went above, maybe 5,000 feet. But yeah. on the long reconnaissance shows, we always flew back to the coast, back to Abbeville, which was 60 or 80 miles away. And during that time, we climbed until we got to 18,000 feet. Because if you weren't on top, you were a dead duck. Yeah. And we always crossed the lines at 18,000, and sometimes as high as 20.
But you were crossing the lines, and your craft was altogether different. You were crossing the line at a very low altitude.
Not over 100 feet.
Yeah.
That's when I was doing contact patrol.
Yeah.
When the push was on, I was always assigned to contact patrol.
One of the things I wanted to ask you was the clothing and the armament. What clothing, I suppose it was standard. Now, what was your normal outfit?
Well, first of all, we had a suit that was fur-lined, and it covered our body and legs. And then we had fur-lined boots that came up to our knees, and we had a headgear and goggles so that there was no exposed part of our anatomy, because we were sitting in an open-air cockpit.
Yeah.
We had a little windshield in front of us, but it didn't prevent the air from getting to you.
Your costume the same thing, same outfit?
We wore the same thing. We had fur-lined boots right up to here, though, and you'd put on, first of all, you'd rub whale oil on your hands, then you'd put on silk gloves, and then woolen gloves, and then fur-lined gloves, gauntlets right up to here. Then you'd put your hands on the red-hot exhaust pipes when you were up in the air to take the frost out of your fingers. Because we were flying at 20,000 feet, and up there it might be 30 or 40 below zero. Because the temperature drops 1 degree for every 300 feet.
Yeah. The
So
highest
you can
we
figure
flew,
in March.
the highest we flew was 13,000 feet, and that was when we were taking photographs.
Yeah. That was about as high as you could get in that
And we
plane.
could go higher, but that's as far as as high as we went. You see, we were not a fighting machine. Our efforts were to get information, and we just relied on being able to withstand attacks by our machine guns. But we never set out to attack an enemy plane.
No. No, it's quite a difference in concept. I have a couple pictures here. I think we'll just show them now if we can pick them up. This is Nipper as a young man. He's almost as good looking then as he is now, I think. Eh? There he is. Just a kid. He was only 19 when the whole thing was over. Eh?
Yeah.
And then we have one other. This is a rare picture, too, because this is a full squadron of Dr. Carey's squadron. And no use showing which one is he. You wouldn't be able to pick it out anyway. But the importance about this one is that we have the names of everybody in that squadron. So it's a historian's delight.
Wish I had one of those.
Yeah. Now, I want one other thing. Dr. Carey lost his logbook. Every pilot has a logbook. I'm opening this one of Nipper's at July 1918. And on the 18th of July, he was at Bray, strong wind on the roof. What does that mean?
Well, up high, 18,000, 20,000 feet.
Then on the next day at 4 a.m., he's on the dawn patrol. He's got out of luck, no Huns about. And then on the 20th, he shot up a Hun two-seater at 10,000 feet over Cambrai, indecisive. That means you don't know whether it was a kill or not, eh? And then the next day, the 22nd, he had a day off there. 22nd, he made a Hun balloon observer jump out. Now tell me something about those observation balloons.
Well, of course, they were on a cable, and they usually flew about 4,000 feet, and they'd be a couple of miles back of the lines. Well, these fellows in the basket with binoculars could see way over into our area, and they could see what we were doing. And if there was a lot more trucks today than yesterday, they'd know that something was going to happen. And they reported that to their own side, of course. And they had these damn balloons about every half a mile, you think, or a mile maybe?
About every mile, I would think.
They were right along in a string behind the German lines, and each one, as I say, was attached to this cable, which came down to the ground around a pulley and was attached to a truck. And when they wanted to pull it down, all they had to do was start the truck and just race it down the road, and down the balloon came to faster than an airplane could catch it, you know.
But what you're saying on this entry, this day, is you made the balloon be pulled down, or did the man actually jump out of it?
Well, the guy jumped out when I started to shoot at him, that's all.
Yeah. When they had parachutes, but...
Oh, yeah, sure.
Well, now, you shot down any of these observation balloons?
I shot, there was one I shot down. At least it may have been coming down when I started shooting at it, but that's the only one time I had contact with one.
Yeah.
Well, did it explode?
As far as I remember. I'm a little hazy about it, but I remember I put a few bursts in it too.
Yeah, I might point out these balloons were filled with hydrogen, which is a highly inflammable material.
Sure. They went off like a firecracker when they...
Well, I'm going on here to August the 11th. You're on the 6 p.m. flight, and a burst of bullets through the rear petrol tank and the controls. And now, did you have to crash land that plane that time, or?
I did get down and siphon some gas out because the hole was right there. There was a hole that big right in the corner of this 40-gallon tank that I was sitting on, see? And I didn't want the damn thing to catch fire. So I landed on our side as quickly as I could and found an old piece of hose and siphoned 10 or 15 or 20 gallons out so that the gas was way down and wouldn't slop out anymore.
And then you took off and got back to your airdrome.
Yeah.
Now, what about you? Did you ever have your gas tank hit? Like you really were fired at a great deal when you were firing so low.
Well, the gas tank in the AW was in front of me, but there was another, I guess the big tank was behind me, and it very often got a burst of machine gun fire, which would put a few holes in it, but I had to land sometimes behind the lines, but I always managed to get back to our own side of the lines.
But those machine gun bullets, then, they didn't have the incendiary bullets that they had.
Yes, they did.
Did they?
Every second one was an incendiary, or every third one anyway. Explosive.
Yeah. But you never had your gas tank catch fire?
No.
No.
The only thing they didn't use was dum-dums. I think that was outlawed, and I don't think they ever used. We never used them anyway. You know, I mean the soft ones that.
Yeah, that had a little cross cut in them, so they'd fragment more. Eh? Well, now you know you look at the pictures of these airplanes, and they look very beautiful and handsome and everything. But honestly, they were some of the most fragile things that were ever put together. Were they not?
No! Oh hell no! The Bristol fighter was one of the best airplanes I've ever seen. Just as good as anything you'll see on an aerodrome today.
But no, listen, Nipper was just made of wood and a wooden frame with
wood
canvas stretched over.
Fabric, but well, look at the thing. It was as solid as you could imagine, and a beautiful engine.
No.
The engine never let me down on all the hundreds of hours I flew.
That was a Rolls-Royce engine,
Yeah.
that, wasn't it? As a matter of fact, that was the Rolls-Royce engine that was the ancestor of the Second World War Rolls-Royce engine that they used in the Spitfires and Hurricanes.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Well, and all the time I flew, I never had anything happen to my airplane that I had to come down. I mean, I didn't ever have a wing get floppy or anything like that. Mind you, I've had an engine failure, a water pump maybe pack up, and I'd have to shut it off to save the engine and land for that reason. But so far as baling wire and that sort of thing, nothing like that ever happens. They
Well,
were
what
beautiful.
about your aircraft? Did you feel it was well constructed? And
Oh, yes, the Armstrong Whitworth was a good serviceable aircraft, but the main disadvantage, it didn't have any top speed worth mentioning. The best of them wouldn't do more than 80 miles an hour. And if you were flying into a 30-mile-an-hour wind and were doing 70 miles an hour, you were actually only going 40 miles an
Yeah,
hour.
which would-
You're just a sitting duck.
make you a pretty good target for
Oh,
somebody
yeah.
on the ground
We
shooting
could
again.
fly 130 miles an hour.
Well, that's interesting. You felt they were very serviceable planes, very well built. You're always reading stories about the wing falling off a camel
Oh, no.
or something like that.
I never saw a wing fall off.
No. And but really, the airplane, you know, it only goes back to about when, 1905. There was some earlier, I guess 1903, there was a kind of a flight, but really this is from 1905. In 15 years,
Yes.
or 12 years, they really developed the airplane very, very quickly.
Oh, yeah.
I think the first Channel flight was about 1909.
Yeah, that was Blériot. I
Yes.
think, yeah.
The first what?
The one
Channel
across
flight.
the English Channel.
Oh,
A
yes.
Frenchman flew across the English Channel.
And I was, after the war was over, I was assigned the job of bringing back some planes from France to England. And we would always get up to 10,000 feet before we started across the channel, because if we lost an engine on the way over, then we could glide to the shore. And if you flew over at 1,000 feet and you lost your engine, you'd have to have no
No.
alternative but to land in the ocean.
Well, tell me something about the landing thing on these. If you did have engine trouble, you know, when you're up in the air, these planes were very maneuverable for gliding, eh?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, nowadays airplanes don't glide very well because they're...
Very highly powered.
I was up in a helicopter one day with a fellow. I said, if your engine quits, how hard do these things come down? Oh, he says, you can usually walk away, but they come down like a rock. Could I tell you about one experience we had? I was leading a show, and we were 20 or 30 miles over the lines, and the fog started to come in off the channel. Well, we were up pretty far north in France, you know. And before we could get to the lines, on our own side of the lines, all our area in the north of France was covered with fog. So we had to fly south and south and south, and to try to find a place where we could get down through the broken clouds. And finally, we had to come down because we were running out of petrol. So the whole 10 of us landed, just in a field, or in any field. We were spread all over the countryside, of course. I was the only one that didn't crash. I mean, they just turned up on their nose and broke the propeller or hit a fence or something, you know. Well, there happened to be a British hospital for horses there, wounded horses, that hadn't moved north when they moved the British Army north. So they bedded us down and gave us a meal, but they didn't have any telephone. So the whole 20 of us were reported missing, of course. And that was pretty rough at the squadron, of course. More than half the squadron gone, you know, in one day. So the next morning, we scrounged some petrol from a French aerodrome and filled up my tanks, and I took off. Held up my finger to see how the wind was blowing, you know. That was the navigation we had. And And I flew back to the squadron. We were way down near Rouen, way the hell gone off our map. So they were very glad to see me, I'll tell you, when I told them that everybody was safe.
Yeah.
All they had to do then was send out trucks and pick up all these crashed machines, which took 2 or 3 weeks, because these guys weren't anxious to come back. You know, they were having a good time at Rouen.
Well, I'm going to ask you, Dr. Carey, about the point that Nipper just raised. What instruments did you have in an airplane? We're sort of now an airplane, they tell me, has got so many instruments that the pilot can hardly look at them all.
Well, as far as I can remember, we had three instruments. We had an altimeter that told us our height, and we had an airspeed indicator that told us our speed ahead, and then there was a rev counter that told you the engine speed. And that, together with the compass, were the only instruments we had.
Yeah. And so that really, and you had no radio communication.
Oh, no.
At all. And
No,
so,
I could send, but I couldn't receive.
Yeah. So that, but you didn't send at all in your
No,
plane.
we didn't have anything like that.
No. Well, now tell me then, your whole flights, as a Nipper story illustrated, are dependent on the weather, eh? You just had to.
Oh, yeah. Well, in the summertime, we flew nearly every day. There'd be an odd day that we wouldn't. But when you got into October and November, you'd often have 3 or 4 days in a row where you couldn't fly. You had to have weather conditions that you could at least see the ground from 100 feet. There's no use going up in fog or cloud.
I can still feel the batman's hand on my shoulder. Time to get up, Mr. Scott. The weather's fine. This is 5 o'clock in the morning. It's dark, you know.
Just like a farm boy, get out and do the chores, eh? Well, now, I might point out that in 1918, when both of you, the latter half of 1918, when both of you had your experience, was a time really of Allied ascendancy in the air. And which is probably the reason why you're both still alive, because the Germans had airplane ascendancy in 15, we had it in 16, they had it in 17, we had it in 18, and also in 1918, in the spring of the year, the Germans had put on that big push.
Yeah.
And then in the time that both of you were in flying, we were pushing them back very quickly.
It just started then.
Yeah.
At least when I got out, we were stationary, and then within 3 weeks we started pushing them back.
Yeah.
And I never saw a German plane the last 2 months in the war.
Yeah. But
what you say, we had the ascendancy. They didn't come on our side of the lines anymore.
No.
When Bishop and Barker and those guys were making their kills, they could fight at their own odds, because the Germans were on our side of the lines.
Yeah.
Now, when we had a fight with them, if there were 10 of us, they wouldn't attack us until they had 40.
Yeah.
We never had even odds.
No.
And of course, they could choose the odds because we were 20 miles over on their side, and we had to fight because we couldn't do anything else. We had to get home.
Yeah.
So all our fights were with their odds very much against us. You see, what happened was when we crossed the lines at 18,000 feet, heading for, let's say, Cambrai, the first balloon section, or the first anti-aircraft battery that saw us, telephoned back to the nearest aerodrome and said there are 10 Bristol fighters approaching at 18,000 feet, heading for Cambrai. Well, then,
Go ahead. You go ahead.
then these guys and their aerodromes, 15 miles, 20 miles behind the lines, would take off and meet us up there. But not just 10, it'd be 40.
Yeah.
And we'd have a dogfight that was really a dogfight. We might lose 3 planes, and they might lose 5 or 6. And when you get into a dogfight like that, it's every man for himself, because formations just get broken up, and all you can do is just try to keep somebody from shooting you down, that's all. Now, mind you, the observer at the back in a 2-seater was a big help, because we were firing 30 guns. I had 3 on my plane. Everybody had 3. 2 firing forward and 1 firing back, see? So these dogfights were pretty vicious things, I'll tell you.
Well, that's kind of interesting. And then you always had to keep enough gas to try and get home.
Well, yeah, of course you had to do that.
But your main danger was not enemy airplanes, but the people on the ground firing
That's right.
at you.
Because during a push, I was always flying contact patrol, and we were only up between 50 and 100 feet, so that the only enemy fire that we encountered was the enemy machine guns.
Yeah. Now, tell me about this contact patrol, because it's kind of interesting. In October 1918, the enemy were retreating pretty quickly, or we were driving them back very quickly. Now, you're flying over our troops, and you're trying to see where the enemy lines are and where their artillery is?
Yes. Well, I wasn't interested in artillery because it would be moved back before, but I was interested in locating and firing upon the German troops.
Yeah.
And that would let our troops know where they were.
Yeah.
Of course, they could find out by climbing over the trenches.
But what you were reporting is where there are concentrations of German troops and where our troops had got to.
Yes.
So that our artillery wouldn't fire on them.
Yes. Our artillery always fired ahead of our own troops, of course.
Yeah. Well, now, in 1918, when the Germans are in retreat and they're moving their troops backward, there was a lot of strafing done, by our planes.
Yes, and there was at another time, too. When I first got there on the 13th of March, the Germans were pushing very hard. In fact, they drove us out of our aerodrome. They shelled us out of our aerodrome. But they were trying to break the British and the French apart at Amiens.
Yeah.
And they were so desperate, they were moving up their troops by the thousand on the broad daylight through the Somme Valley. Now, the Somme Valley in March is just a quagmire where you go right up to here if you step off the road. And these troops were marching, and artillery, horse-drawn artillery, everything was marching on this pavé road leading up to Amiens. And during the day, every airplane in the whole area was down there firing machine guns into them. You'd just fire your machine guns till they were empty and go back and get loaded up again and come back. We must have killed hundreds and thousands of troops. And the horses would get jumping around and they'd dump the artillery in the ditch in the mud. But they kept on doing it, and I don't know how many people I killed that day, maybe 5 or maybe 100, I don't know.
Well, did you have some strafing? Did you do some strafing too in those last months of the war?
Oh, yes, because the Germans were retreating at that time in October, and we would pick up groups that were trying to go back and strafe them with machine gun fire.
Yeah, well, now we when November the 11th, when the armistice came, you were on leave.
I was in England. I was in London, yes.
What was the atmosphere in London like?
Oh, you wouldn't believe. I never saw so many millions of people and all in one place. Oh, gosh. Well, they didn't go home. They stayed out all night singing and dancing and drinking. Oh, gosh.
Yeah, it was such a, that First World War was such a bloodbath, and so many people were killed in it. I think everybody just must have been delirious when it ended.
I managed to get into a little restaurant for my dinner that night. I don't know how, because they were all jam-packed full. But this was a Lyons Corner House restaurant. And years later, when I was living in Hamilton in the bank, I was boarding at a place, and I happened to mention that on Armistice night I'd had my dinner in this particular restaurant. And this woman had been the cashier in that restaurant that day. And from then on, there was a little tot of whiskey on my dresser every night. And she did all my shirts and my laundry for nothing. I was the white-haired boy, I'll tell you.
Well, now, you were still in France in Armistice Day.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, you flew the last patrol for your
Yes, well,
squadron.
I was a flight commander then, so I made out the order of flights, and I put myself to go out at 10:30 in the morning. So I was up at 11 o'clock when the war was over. we were at Cambrai, and we were at near Menin at that time. That's just on the River Lys.
Yes.
So that was the last day of the war, and I was up in the air at 11 o'clock that morning.
Where? Well, then you both came home, eh? And
Not right then.
oh well,
6 or 8 months later.
yeah. And when you came home, now you have to. You've had all this exciting time of your life. You're 19 years old.
When
you
I
come
came
back.
home, the St. Thomas Times-Journal said Captain N.B. Scott returns home from overseas having served with the Royal Flying Corps. That's all they said. They didn't say what a hell of a guy I was or how many flight commander at 19 shot down so many airplanes and all this stuff. But 65 years later, I'm in the paper every couple of weeks. And this thing. Now, this fellow, what's his name?
The newspaper reporter.
Sterling Ince came out to my place with a TV camera and a talkie thing, and he took a half-hour's interview. Beautiful thing. I spoke very nicely. I didn't swear.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
And he showed it. He ran it through for us. After he got through, he said, "I'll just show you." And he ran it through his little machine. That happened. And it was written up by this guy in the paper here about a month ago that bollocks it up a bit. And, I was in that Centennial book and
Yeah.
how I got a whole page in that. You didn't get anything in that because they got your picture wrong.
Oh, well, we made a bad mistake in that first edition. We put two pictures
Those
of Nipper
pictures
in
are
it.
both of me, see, but they had his name under one of them.
Yeah, well, that was a terrible insult.
Oh,
They put a picture
I
of
said I wouldn't sue them if he didn't.
Well, Doctor, you came home, you got home here in New York Central, 30th of April, 1919, with snow on the ground.
There's 2 inches of snow on the ground.
Yeah. And then what did you do? You went, you'd
Well,
been in medical school.
Well, I loafed around for a few weeks, and then I went down to Brantford to visit my future wife. We started to go together when she was down to college. And by the time summer came, I couldn't see any business opportunities for me because my father wasn't in business. So I decided to go back to medicine. And I took a refresher course during the summer, which the university supplied us for at no expense. And I started my second year in September of 1919, and I graduated in 1923, in May of that year. And then 2 months later, I went to Detroit and joined the staff of the Ford Hospital as a surgical intern, and I spent a year at the Ford Hospital, following which I went over to Edinburgh, Scotland, and took 2 months postgraduate surgery there before returning to St. Thomas to start practice.
And then you were head surgeon in St. Thomas and
I was
had a long, distinguished medical career here.
I was the head surgeon in the old Memorial Hospital until it moved to the new hospital.
Yep. Now, Nipper, you had been in the bank. You went back to the bank?
I went back to the bank after about 6 months, yeah. I thought I had to have a holiday. I don't know why. But anyway, I used my holiday by taking the LNPS down to Port Stanley every morning, go to the bathhouse, get into my bathing suit, and swim out to the lighthouse and run back on the lighthouse pier. I did that every day, all summer. I was in pretty good shape by the end of the summer because that's about a mile out there, you know. Stupid thing to do because I was all by myself and sometimes there were waves this high, you know. But that's the way I spent my summer. But let me tell you about one incident that sticks in my mind. It was a beautiful day in August in France, and we were having a game of cricket out on the field with the officers against the men when an urgent order came through from the wing. They wanted information about something that was going on behind Charleroi. Now, Charleroi in those days was as far away as Berlin, damn near. And it was such a risky business that they would risk only 2 machines. So the commanding officer, of course, picked out the senior flight commander to do this show and told him he could choose whomever he wished to go with him. And by gosh, he chose me out of all the other 17 pilots. And I wasn't even in his flight, which was quite a compliment, I thought. But it was kind of backhanded because nobody expected us to come back. However, it just happened that day that there were beautiful cumulus clouds from 5,000 feet right up to the ceiling. Oh, gosh. And we were able to play hide and seek through these cloud banks all the way over and back, and there was never a shot fired. We got the pictures.
You got the pictures.
That's one thing that stands in my mind as a real compliment, because he wanted somebody that he could rely on, that's all.
We have 5 minutes left, I think.
Oh, good.
So we're...
Let me tell you about something else I saw one time. I was flying about, maybe 14,000 feet close to our own lines, and a balloon, one of our own balloons, shot past me like a skyrocket, just pow, right up into the wild blue yonder. The shrapnel shell had cut the cable, and these guys were headed for the sky. Well, they were going so fast that they must have been flat on their ass on the floor, because they couldn't have been standing up, they were accelerating so fast. So I watched them, and when they got up to about 25,000 feet, I saw two little white umbrellas about this big appear. They managed to stand up and jump out. I don't know how well they could breathe up there. But this breathing business, at 20,000 feet, if you sat still and didn't do anything, you could breathe just like we're breathing now. But if you had to reach out and try to correct a stoppage in your machine gun, you'd fall back exhausted.
Yeah, but you couldn't really stay up there too long at that.
Oh, yeah, certainly we did. 2 hours.
You did.
It wasn't a case of not being able to breathe. You could breathe perfectly well if you sat still.
As long as you weren't exerting yourself. And you didn't freeze to death.
We never flew over 13,000 feet.
No.
Kind of laugh nowadays when these jokers turn on the oxygen at 8,000 feet.
Yep.
See, that the other day, yesterday, when those planes flew into the ground, I simply can't understand that. One guy might make a mistake, but not four, surely.
Well, surely probably what happened is you're talking about that acrobatic team in the States. I suppose one man made the mistake, and that they were so close together, maybe that did in for all four of them. But what was your most outstanding memory? Like Nipper's got that picture of the balloon escaping, and do you think of anything?
Well, it's pretty hard to pick out just one incident. I did have one occasion when my machine got pretty well riddled with bullets, and I had to just land behind our line, but I was able to get over on our side, and as soon as we hit the ground, we immediately got out of the machine because we knew the Germans would shell it.
Yeah.
So we had to go back on foot.
I think something should be said about a plane going down in flames. I've seen 2 of ours and 3 of theirs all in one fight going down in flames. And when you get all the gasoline in an airplane on fire, it's just frightful. The flames run around 25 or 30 feet, blood red, and great palls of black smoke. And of course, it's all fanned by the fact that the plane is diving to the ground 3 miles high, and there are 2 fellows in there that are friends of yours, They can't jump out because they have no parachutes. Well, they can jump out if they can't stand the heat, but they have 3 choices, and they're all dandies. They can either jump out into thin air 3 miles high, or they can shoot themselves with a pistol some fellows carried for the purpose, or they can sit there and fry now. Nice chances, eh?
No, it wasn't with all the sort of romance that gets talking about with war. It still is it's a very bloody and a very dangerous and a very callous profession of fighting. Had to do it several times. Tell me something else, and just in closing. Did you ever fly again after you came home?
Yes.
Piloting plane yourself?
The year was about 1945 or 6, and at that time, the Memorial Hospital had a branch out at New Sarum for the overflow. And one Wednesday, when I was out there, I decided I'd go to the aerodrome, which is part of the space there, and I asked if I could take up a plane. And the fellow looked at me and he said, "When did you fly last?" Well, I said, "The last time I flew was in 1919, and then this was in 1946. Well, he said, "We'll let you take up a plane, but we'll also provide you with a pilot to go up." So we went up, he let me take it off, and I flew it down to Port Stanley and back. And then when we got back to the aerodrome, I said, "Well, I guess I'll let you land it. I've had all the flying I want."
Nipper, did you ever fly?
No, I never got a chance.
I think we're going to have to wind this program up, and I'm sorry now that I didn't do a program with each of you individually, because I'm sure you have a lot more to tell us, but I do want to thank you very, very much for recreating so vividly that period of 1918.